Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm coming to you solo to do something I've never done: record a podcast about someone else's podcast. This time, for the first time, it's about a very popular show. In fact, I think it's in the top 5 of all shows on Apple, Pod Save America. And a week or so ago, they had the top 4 members of Kamala Harris's campaign team on with one of the co-hosts, Dan Pfeiffer, to talk about what had happened during the, as they noted many, many times, 107 days of what was the Kamala Harris and Tim Walz campaign. And I listened to it. I'd read about it. I'd heard some of the clips. I'd seen some of the clips, but I thought it was important to listen to it all the way through because these are folks who have been through this a lot. David Plouffe, who ran who ran Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. Stephanie Cutter, who's been around for many years. Jen O'Malley Dillon, who ran Joe Biden's campaign in 2020, was running it up until now, until Kamala Harris came on board, continued to run it. And Quentin Fulks, who was the principal deputy campaign manager, and I think his purview was mostly paid advertising. And I got to be honest with you guys, I was disappointed, but not at all surprised. If you read my Substack, you saw that last week I wrote a piece called "In Defeat, There Must Be Accountability." And I was hoping for a little bit of candor in this 90-minute conversation. I was hoping for a little bit of responsibility in this conversation. And I was hoping for some accountability in this conversation. We got none of that, unfortunately. I'm not surprised, as I said, but it was a textbook case of Washington, D.C.-itis. Something very bad happened. And as Ronald Reagan said, failure is an orphan and victory has a million fathers. And this defeat seems to be the loneliest orphan. But I have a hard time, again, as long as I've been in this, is that if you take on the reins of something like this, if you have decided that after decades in the business that you want to climb to the mountaintop, you want to be responsible for running a presidential campaign, for the most consequential office humanity's ever known, then the decisions you make, right or wrong, should have some accountability. If you win a presidential race, no matter how badly the campaign actually ran internally, you are feted for all time as a political genius, and the both public and financial garlands roll out before you for years and years and years and years. If you lose, oftentimes in the past, it was, okay, pre-Trump, we lost this one, we'll try and get him again next time. That's not where we live. The invitations to speak about what happened on the losing campaign and all of the excuses why, the invitations to Harvard to sit alongside the opponent's campaign manager and have a thoughtful discussion about the race. Those things all still happen. But I think that they are a vestige of a time that really, I think, ended the moment Donald Trump came down the escalator at his Trump Tower 9.5 years ago. And, there's a couple takeaways aside from those that I just mentioned. Was it seemed to me that the Democrats, even after all this time, are still very much fighting a conventional campaign against the ultimate unconventional candidate. Whether or not Joe Biden had stayed in the race, whether or not it had been Kamala Harris, whether or not they had had some primary where they came up with a completely new option, the truth is that the campaign was conventional. I should say this, it's not totally fair. It wasn't conventional at the outset. When Biden dropped out and Harris got in, the wave of relief propelled Kamala Harris through that first 4, 5, 6 weeks of her campaign, really, from June, whenever it was, all the way through her convention. And I think a lot of that was because there just wasn't any time to do anything other than, run the wildest and craziest, seat of your pants, shoot from the hip kind of campaign. My sense is that the energy went out of it when the Democrats realized they were Democrats and, God forbid we have fun. God forbid we do something that feels good as opposed to doing something that seems to be exciting people. And they went conventional. They went conventional hard, and they lost. And I think a lot of it we should remember is that I have thought for a long time that Donald Trump couldn't win the race, but Democrats could lose it. And in my estimation, I think that's what happened. Yes, Donald Trump got more votes, but millions of otherwise would be or should be Democratic voters chose to sit it out, even in the context of who we were up against. And during the course of the 90-minute conversation on Pod Save America, there was little, if no, time dedicated to why Kamala Harris's base stayed home in many, many places, such as Detroit and Philadelphia. At one point, one of the four notes that Harris did very well or much better in the Milwaukee suburbs, the western, they call the WOW counties. Doesn't really matter if you lose the state. Doesn't really matter if 2 million urban voters that otherwise turned out in 2020 didn't this time. It's not enough to say we did better here, but we lost. It's not enough to say, oh, we were close. As you've heard me say before, guys, like close only matters in two things: horseshoes and hand grenades. And I think there was a detachment almost from the race from O'Malley, Dillon, and Cutter, and Pluff, and Fulks that really said to me that maybe they didn't believe all of the things they were saying about Donald Trump being the threat to democracy and the American way of life that I believe he is. And I think that so many of you believe he is. Because if they believed that, then there would have been, I think, a lot more remorse and concern about what comes next, as opposed to, well, we've got to look forward to 2026 and 2028. Well, yeah, because those are the next two scheduled general elections in this country. But it also means that you spent so little time in the aftermath worrying about it that when you had an opportunity to play a home game on Pod Save America, which is what it was, that you didn't even think it was worth bringing up. This was one of the pillars of your campaign, that Trump was a fascist. Again, I think he has incredibly fascistic tendencies, and I think the decisions we see him making now only back that up. But again, if you've had 107 days and $1.5 billion to spend, and you can't turn out your own voters, you got to answer some hard questions. Now, there was a piece of it that said, well, maybe they lean too much into bringing Republicans along and the Liz Cheney effect of campaigning with her. And I would say this is, I actually think that while, yes, I believe that it is harder for Democrats to compete in every state, really, in more states, and that's a whole other conversation we need to have. The truth was it was a little bit backward, which was, when we started the Lincoln Project 5 years ago, and so many others, whether or not it was Republican voters against Trump or, various veterans group that came from the center right, we were not Democrats. We were others. And I think that we had a credibility to speak to those Republicans because we had just come from a party. We were taking on our own. And I think that the Harris campaign thought that they needed to fight that fight. And maybe they did. But it seems to me that if you were going for single digits worth of the electorate, 2, 3, 4, 5% at best, but you weren't paying attention to your own voters, those that you must have had to get across the line, then I think you probably would have been better off leaving it to the people that knew how to speak to them and going out to figure out how to make sure your base turned out. Now, let me say this. I have to check my own premises on this too, which is I and so many of my colleagues and friends and people in the quote unquote never Trump movement, I think we lost a lot of credibility. I think we had it in 20, and I think we had it in 2022, and it really worked. But I think in the intervening couple of years, instead of being a third force, a pro-democracy force that fought alongside the Democratic Party but was separate and apart from it, I think we became part of the big D Democratic coalition in the hopes that that would help us save the small d democracy. And I think we got a little too comfortable thinking, well, look at all these people who are so nice to us and who like us. I don't know whether or not they like us that much at all. It's really not my concern at this point. But I think that instead of being the third force that could go take on Trump directly and stay in his face as we had in 2020, or go point out specific things to specific voters, which I think we still tried to do in this campaign, I think that we lost a lot of credibility because we, in our zeal to be loyal soldiers to the overall cause, I think that we allowed ourselves, or I'll say this, I self-co-opted, if that's a saying. I allowed myself to be absorbed into everything a Democrat did was good and everything a Republican did was bad, and never the twain shall meet, when I think there was a real opportunity for us to nudge our Democratic friends out of minefields of their own making or those of Trump's, instead of just saying, can you believe what he said this time? Which, of course, we'd always said, but obviously had far less purchase. And so that's something that I need to do a lot of thinking about. And I think all of us need to do a lot of thinking about in the days, weeks, and months to come. And I would also say this is, my friend Trygve Olsen often said about the never Trump people getting Republicans and Republican leaning independents across the line to then first Biden and then Harris, is the Democrats had to get to the 2-yard line. And if they could get to the 2-yard line, we could help them get to the end zone. The problem is the Democrats got to the 5. It didn't matter if we got them to the 3, they were still going to be short. There were never going to be enough Republicans or disaffected independents to make up the delta between all of those Democrats staying home. And I think that was one thing that needs to be studied more. And I certainly will be thinking about it. During the course of the episode, they spend a lot of time talking about testing and the ad spend and all of this stuff. And when they were talking about this now infamous trans ad that the Trump campaign started running, and then the Trump super PAC started running as well, they seemed a little bit surprised that somehow, the ad spend on that particular commercial for the Trump campaign was only 7% of its overall ad budget, but that the earned media had blown it up. Well, look, if you're a Republican, that's always been the idea, right? Points on television, first of all, guys, it's 2024, not 1992, but gross rating points on broadcast television or cable television is a metric of the last millennia, not even the last century. And the idea that you didn't create ads that were going to generate further excitement or attention, but only going to be speaking to somebody who's really not watching it directly anyway, is just antithetical to how Republicans win. If you go back and look at some of our Lincoln Project ads, right? Think about the guys, the one that put us on the map in early May of 2020, right? We got inside Trump's head because we advertised to him in the White House. And what happened? He exploded. He attacked us on Twitter, right? He made happen what we wanted to have happen. We lured him in and he took the bait. And that ad blew up, and we as an organization blew up. And the idea that Republicans could stand with the country over him blew up. Was it the defining factor of the race? Well, for us, it was. And it really put the idea that Trump was beatable on the map. But again, if you're surprised by the idea that an ad generated so much light, heat, and noise on social media and ultimately earned media that it had effects far beyond its paid, boundaries, like that's, to me, campaign 101, guys. And so they talked a little bit about, okay, well, we tested all these ads and there wasn't any good response. Well, you have to come up with something. Like, that's the point. You went 3 weeks. You went 3 weeks without responding. And there was nothing to say that, Kamala Harris believes, in whatever cultural thing is. And I think that's another important point, too, about all of this testing. And, they wanted to go out and have a common sense conversation with the American people about the economy. Like they're selling toothpaste. Like, this isn't selling toothpaste, gang, right? You have to go display confidence and dominance and leadership and push back on stuff and say, these people are bad people about everything. They're saying bad things about Americans one more time. Should anybody be surprised? But that was an ad that had a very long tail because they were able to use Vice President Harris' words against her from the 2019-2020 primary cycle. But it took the campaign 3 weeks to do enough research to find out that it was actually something that came along during the Trump administration. Well, that would have been good to know, because then you could have had adequate pushback. But they kept saying, well, it wasn't showing up in polling as somebody's biggest issue. No, because it wasn't an issue ad. It was a cultural ad. And that's the one thing I keep trying to explain. Republicans fight culture wars, and they wage campaigns based on values. That was a values ad. Whose values more represent yours? Whose culture more represents yours? And that was what I think Democrats have always, for a very long time, had a really hard time understanding, is that you can do all the testing you want. You can do all the polling you want. You're not going to divine how someone feels about something from an algorithm. If there was this thing over and over again about, we didn't want to fight on their side of the field. Republicans are perfectly happy to fight on the Democrat side of the field, right? That's why they keep gobbling up people, because they're willing to go take turf. And the idea, Pluff said, well, listen, we have to win the middle. It's hard to win these battleground states. Yeah, it is. And it's getting harder, right? It's getting harder. Guys, we are on the beach. The American Republic is on the beach, and we are fixing to get pushed into the water, right? Every time the Democrats lose, let's say they lose, John Tester's Senate seat, which they did in Montana. Do you think someone's in Montana right now saying, where do we go from here? How do we rebuild? How do we go, win some state and local races? How do we go and contact voters with a different vision of the Democratic Party? I don't think so. Probably not. Nor did they do that in Nebraska or North or South Dakota when those, Senate seats flipped. And so, guys, like, the idea of this kind of stuff is not going to get easier. And I spend time on it only because, again, I was just frankly unsatisfied with the level of analysis or thoughtfulness that I heard. And I think, again, if you have been chosen to run the Vice President of the United States campaign and spend $1.5 billion of donors' money, of Americans' money, I think that you should have a little bit more to say than, oh, well, we'll get him next time. Because, again, I hope to God there is a next time. I'm not being hyperbolic. I said this 2 years ago at a dinner party that I got invited to, and I'll probably never get invited back to one of them. Oh, well, if Trump wins in 2024, then DeSantis will run in 2028. Like, what are you talking about? I mean, what do you mean? What if there isn't a 2028? And then they look at you like, the dog that doesn't understand what's being said. And so to me, that's part of it, is just like, after all this time, still don't understand the fight they're in. And let me speak to that more broadly. There was a lot of frustration on the part of those being interviewed by Dan Pfeiffer about sort of the logistics of, the things they had to face. And I wrote a little bit about this. And so, there was only 107 days to campaign. Okay. Given that, Harris did pretty well. Why doesn't the Democratic Party have more super PACs? Why are their lawyers so cautious? Why is it that, Trump and the Republicans are so much better coordinated? Why didn't either the Biden campaign and then the Harris campaign have the ability to messaging earlier, tell their allies what they needed, and go before Labor Day? Why did the press give them so much grief? And guys, you've probably heard me over the years, like, this is not new to Republican politics. It's just that the Trump people mixed with, call it the vast right-wing conspiracy of Leonard Leo and the Kochs and everybody else on the right, have just really, they are very, very good at it. The MAGA is not a political party. It's a movement, and it's a self-supporting, self-sustaining movement. And the Democratic Party is a collection of, disparate interest groups and coalitions that are frankly far too divided, I think, on identity lines and demographic lines, as opposed to what do Americans think they want in this time, as opposed to how do we cobble together this group of people A, that group of people B, those group of people C, and try and get to 50% plus one, as opposed to saying, what's our overall message? And they just still don't get it. Like, why are Republicans coordinated? Because they get in line. because they follow the lead of whoever the leader is. In this case, it's Donald Trump and his campaign, and we've been doing this for years. I said before, when a Republican, when I worked for George W. Bush and he gave a speech, it was as if, Moses had carried down clay tablets. And everybody in the Republican ecosystem said this was a great speech, this was the best policy, et cetera, et cetera. Democrats can't get out of their own way. They get mad at one another. In fact, I think one thing that I really do appreciate Quentin Fulks saying, and I think maybe he should have been the campaign manager, was that, if Democrats get out of line, other Democrats attack them, right? If somebody has a misstep or says something that's outside the orthodoxy, like Seth Moulton did on the transgender issue, the instinct is to attack and keep the orthodoxy moving forward, as opposed to saying, now maybe we should think about this. Maybe the fact that everybody's talking about it now is overblown, but maybe it speaks to a larger issue, which is if the world perceives that these are the things that we care about, is it their problem or is it our problem? And I would posit that if you are trying to sell something that you say is blue, but the world sees as red, then that is your fault, not the people who are seeing it as the wrong color. And, that's all that, I see all this stuff about, Democratic policies really are more popular than Republican policies. It doesn't matter, because for the average voter, they got to cut through all this other stuff to figure out what the hell it is you care about. Because there's an elite, right, that says these are the things we care about. There are interest groups who demand to be heard. Fine. Look, everybody gets to be heard. But if everybody gets to be heard, just understand it's very hard to have a cohesive message. And I want to read something, that there's a progressive guy named Hassan Piker, who I haven't met, but I've heard of, and I've listened and watched a couple of things. And remember, guys, this is a guy who, he posts stuff on Stitch, I think it's called, which is like a video game deal, which is so far beyond me, I couldn't even begin to understand it. But he's very popular. He's got a long, long tail, and he has a lot of people listening and watching. And he said this on yet another Pod Save America show. He said, and I quote, pardon me as I get it here. He said, quote, "And when you don't have a North Star that every single person can point to and say, this is what the party is about, your enemies can portray you as whatever they want. And that's why the anti-trans ads are even remotely effective, because you can make the Democratic Party look clownish and inconsistent and even silly and hyper-focused on whatever key issues there are," end quote. And, this is very similar to the kind of thing that you guys have heard me say about why Democrats say, why are we so bad at messaging? Why are you guys so good at messaging? And what have I said? Because messaging is downstream of belief, right? You all can't decide what you believe in. You can't agree on what you believe in. You can't agree on what the things are that you should tell people, right? And if you did have an opinion, you're afraid maybe to say it out loud, because if it's heterodox to the rest of whatever the chattering class is saying at a given moment, you keep your mouth shut because you don't want to get shut down. That's not small d democracy. And that's not good for democracy. And I think you're seeing that happen now, that there are too many people, I think, who are very smart within the Democratic Party who say, to hell with it. It's not worth the trouble. If I believe something, but it's not what, this group believes in, then they're going to attack me. And do I really want that? No, I don't. All right? Because it's easier not to get attacked. But that kind of closing down of intellectual debate, of political debate, of strategic debate, of what the country should be focused on, right? If it's going to be only a small handful of people who utilize their willingness to berate people online to the extent that they are, if we're going to call it canceled or whatever, then the people who you need participating most won't. And the messages you need to get through to all of your various constituencies, won't get through because people aren't listening anymore. And I had a conversation, I think I might have mentioned this on another show. I had a conversation with a Democratic activist in Minnesota. And they said, I got the sense when I went door to door that the Democratic Party didn't even have standing with these voters. And I think that's a pretty shocking indictment for someone who, this person is a self-avowed longtime Democratic activist who knocked on many doors, has raised a ton of money over the years, but didn't feel like that the people she was talking to even considered her or the message she was carrying valid in their lives. And, I think that was the other part too, was so much of the conversation I heard on Pod Save America was so academic and so far apart from where people are that I think it's not surprising this is how things turned out. I want to say this is that as they were closing, Dan Pfeiffer said, quote, "I'm sure I've tortured you long enough." Like, guys, this was not torture. And the reason I know it wasn't torture was something that I saw in a clip of the interview, was that the people, Pluff was on video, but the people in the studio all had notes and notebooks and papers in front of them, which says to me that they had treated this as if they were, being interviewed for 60 minutes. This was not ever designed to be an explanation of what happened during the fall of 2024. It was a defense of their actions. And in that case, like, I get it, but I don't think it's frankly what Kamala Harris deserves. I don't think it's what the country deserves. And I don't think it's what the Democratic Party needs. And to that end, towards the end, Jen O'Malley Dillon said this, quote, "So we lost, and that really sucks. And we came really close. And obviously we believed that we could pull this thing off. And that's something we will all have to live with, and we'll have to live with for the next 4 years," end quote. Like, guys, that's not good enough for me, right? It's not good enough for all of the people who knocked on doors. It's not good enough for all the people who gave $5 or $5 million. It's not good enough for all the people, far more than me, right, who crossed a Rubicon 1, 2, 5, 9 years ago to take on Donald Trump in this movement at the expense of their friends, in some cases their family, a lot of times of their economic security, and in these days, their personal security. And as we look forward to January 20th, my guess is that's going to be more of a reality than anybody wants to think of it. And even if it's not as bad as we think it is, think about where you have to be in a country where people who have been longtime activists fighting for what they believe in are now on the verge of being dissidents, thinking, do I have to have go bags? And do I have to get cash out? And where do I think there's a country I can go where I'll be safe? Will I be audited? Will I be sued? All of those things. And what it said to me was that this was a group of people who think they're going to be okay. And you know what, guys? They probably will be. I know this, in the wake of the 2020 election, like, Trump and company came after my friends and I at the Lincoln Project to the tune of $3 million. They sent nasty mailers to everyone in our neighborhoods and everyone in our zip codes. In fact, they seeded nasty stories about us. And we thought, just stay the course and we'll be okay. And you know what? It wasn't okay. It is in the long run, right? Everybody's turned out fine for the most part. But that's the kind of stuff that's going to happen to more and more people. It's not likely to happen to these people, because my guess is that Donald Trump personally and the people around him don't really see these people as much of a threat. They're not worried about them. They're not worried about who the next chairman or chairwoman of the Democratic Party is, right? They're not worried about who might run for president in 2028, because right now they're on the ascendant. And if we know one thing, and we can see this in the states that they control, is they're going to consolidate the authority they can as quickly as they can, because that's what these kinds of movements do. That's what tyrants do to ensure their own power. And if anybody gets in their way, I don't know that it'll be violent. I hope to God it won't be violent, but it will be pretty rough for a lot of people, especially those who worked for Donald Trump in the White House or in some other capacity and had the bravery to come out and say something about it. That same Liz Cheney that's getting so much grief for having been part of the pro-democracy coalition, right, guys, she's put everything on the line, right? Adam Kinzinger's put everything on the line. There's a lot of people there. And that's the thing that that really at the end disappointed me was this just like lack of seriousness. Like, sorry, we lost. Get them next time. Again, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, maybe. But anything past that, right? Like, we were all owed a better understanding of why they did things. They made some bad choices, right? It can't all be the data's fault. If it's all the data's fault, it's because you're relying on data. It can't be all the polling's fault because you're relying on polling. It can't be the focus group's fault because you're asking 12 people in the center of Wisconsin to decide on $1 billion ad strategy, right? It can't all be their fault. At some point, someone had to make a decision that this was the strategy we were going to go with. These were the ads we were going to run. These were the things that we decided to do. These were the places we decided to go. And if you did it in the context of 107 days in bad political headwinds, okay, you get graded on a curve. But the idea that you're unwilling or unable to take any sort of responsibility for the campaign is really frustrating. And I think it's really frustrating to a lot of people because I think it also speaks to what I believe is a bigger problem, which is there is a big part of the Democratic elite that doesn't believe they're accountable to anybody, let alone the American people, let alone the candidates they work for. And I don't want to go make a bunch of enemies on this. But one thing about Election Day that was a little bit liberating was that so many of us were loyal soldiers, that we saluted and marched forward for 5 years in the idea that we were working for something bigger than ourselves, right? And I am liberated by the fact that here we are now with the pieces laying all around us, and it's all of our jobs who care about this country to figure out where we go from here. And I don't have a D behind my name, not gonna have a D behind my name. I'm not gonna be a Democratic committeeman. I'm not gonna be a local delegate. I'm not gonna run for office. But that doesn't mean that my voice or your voice or any of the voices who truly have been part of this work or haven't, but have a concern about the future of the country, everyone's voice matters. And I think it goes back to this idea of if you're gonna listen, listen. If you're going to take advice, take the advice. But this also means that you have to admit, maybe we did some things wrong. Because if you're not going to do that, then why is a voter going to trust you? Why is a donor going to trust you? Why is a candidate going to trust you? Why is an activist going to trust you? I know a lot of people, hundreds, maybe thousands. One woman came up to me and said, Reed, I knocked on every door. I made every phone call. I sent every text. It didn't matter. She did. She did her part. She worked her heart out for weeks, maybe months on end for free, right? She will go back to work. She will get back to work in her community doing all she can, right? We owe it to her and to all of those people to be honest, to say, we got it wrong. And we got it wrong at the worst possible time. The things I thought I needed to do, I'm not sure it would have mattered one way or the other. But you know what? Like, I got to go back to the drawing board. Because what we did wasn't working. It wasn't good enough. And we got to get to a place of good enough. And I think that's one thing that I hope as you're listening to this, if you get mad at me, I get it. That's fine. But I think that if you're going to be empowered, whether or not it's the Kamala Harris campaign or this Future Forward super PAC that spent like $700 million, it's not our job to put you in charge of the future of the country because you think you know better. You clearly didn't. It's not our job to hope that you figure out the right Rube Goldberg machine of analyses and data and science to deconstruct the average human being to get them to vote for somebody they're just never going to vote for. And let me say this, it was close. It was close. But again, it was close in the wrong direction. It wasn't close because Donald Trump won in a walk. It was close because Kamala Harris's voters stayed home. It was close because, millions of Latinos crossed the line. It was close because 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Those are conversations we need to have, and we need to have out in the open. We need to learn how to talk to this constituency. We need to learn how to talk to that constituency. We need to learn how to talk to this coalition. How about learn how to talk to Americans about what they're concerned about? And when someone says, oh, but you're really for this, say, no, we're not. We're for this. We care about those things, but we understand this. We have to win elections. I've said this for years, guys. It doesn't matter what your issue is, right? The environment, taxes, unemployment, homelessness. Take your pick. It's all not even on the back burner, guys. It's not even in the kitchen for at least the next 4 years, right? If you can't make a compelling argument to all Americans, it's very hard to make a compelling argument to any Americans. And, the good news the Democrats have is two things. And I'm afraid they're going to take the wrong lessons from both of these things if 2026 is a turnaround, let's say in the U.S. House. One is that the American voter is incredibly fickle. They're unhappy all the time. And we've seen that with flip-flopping in the Senate and the House and the White House and these very close margins. The second thing is Democrats are one of two parties. If they're upset with Donald Trump or Republicans, they really got no place else to go. But that doesn't mean you've solved your problem just because the environment in which you operate is conducive to winning every other time. Again, we're not in conventional times. We should not assume that the 2026 election will go the way we want it to go just because that's how it's always gone. We shouldn't assume that the 2028 election will go the way it's supposed to just because, for the most part, that's the way it's always gone. Those times are long gone. They ended on January 6th, 2021, and you have yet to understand the environment in which you're operating in, right? Our opponents are well-resourced, well-staffed, and relentless. They're not going to stop now. They see themselves close to complete ascendancy, and they will do whatever it is they need to. And so if you want to send tweets or blue sky posts, whatever those things are called, right, and talk about like how bad Trump is and all that, like, yes, that's fine. But just understand, like, there's only so much each of us can do on that front, right? The work that we need to do, as I've said in recent episodes, is not in Washington, D.C., right? It's out in the states. It's in the counties. It's in the state capitals. It's in all of those races that matter, because we're not going to get back to a place of par in this country for any reasonable or expected amount of time until and unless Democrats start winning again. And not just the places they're supposed to win, but in some of the places they haven't won. And in too many places where they haven't even competed. And so for me, as I wrap up here, guys, I've worked on various projects with both Stephanie Cutter and Jen O'Malley Dillon. I've known Pluff a little bit. I don't know Quentin. I don't have any doubt about their intelligence or their experience. My concern is, again, this sort of detachment from the whole thing. The idea, and frankly, the idea that, the most popular Big D Democratic podcast would give them an open field, which is, again, isn't surprising. Dan Pfeiffer's not a journalist. He's a friend of theirs. But to go and speak to all, however many millions of people listen to their show and not be honest with them, I think is a disservice to them too. Because if you're not willing to be honest in this time, then like, what do we have? If we're not willing to take a hard look and say, what do we got to do? Then what do we have? And that was the frustrating part for me, was just an unwillingness, as I said, to have any real conversation about what happened other than 107 days, headwinds. It was too hard to get the airplane to Austin so you could have go to Joe Rogan. There weren't enough podcasts. Like, that's all downstream of what I've talked about forever, which is, what the hell do Democrats believe in? What is it that the Democratic Party is going to stand for? Who's going to make that decision? Who are the people that are going to make that decision? It should be an argument. It should be a public argument. It should be an uncomfortable argument. This guy, Hassan Piker, that I mentioned earlier, like when two guys who could not be further apart in background, worldview, or frankly, politics, although, I'm not a Republican anymore, come to the same conclusion about a core shortcoming in the Democratic Party, maybe not a bad idea to take a listen. Anyway, guys, I want you to read this. I called it on Substack. It's called it the Apollo 13 election. Remember that Apollo 13, famously, the Tom Hanks movie is, remember, 1970. They had an explosion in space that was the result of something that had happened in a factory 2 years before the thing ever took off. I think what we're seeing here now is a lot of that. A lot of the problems that doomed Kamala Harris's or even Joe Biden's campaigns to failure happened not in 107 days, but probably a couple of years. And so go to Substack. There's a 3-part series. Again, it's called the Apollo 13 election. I hope you guys will go there. I hope you'll subscribe. If you want to be a paid subscriber, I'd certainly love that. We need all your help. I want to ask you to go to jointheunion.us. Get involved, guys. Just sign up for now. We've got big plans for early next year that we'll be back in touch with. And last but not least, guys, please go to SezUs, SEZ.us. Glad to see Blue Sky blowing up, but now go to SezUs, the social media network for sanity. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom out there, guys. We need as many different outlets we can for good information to get out there. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.